We're here today with Bill Kristol, editor of the Weekly Standard. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
My pleasure.
Can't resist asking you, what about Donald Trump? Does it surprise you?
It sure does. I mean, the one thing I'll say I got right was that I saw early on that Trump was hitting a chord, and I did write an editorial or two saying, don't underestimate him, take him seriously, listen to what he's saying, learn from what he's saying. But I figured that he personally, as a candidate, would kind of rise and then begin to fall. His support would go to the more traditional candidates. 2 weeks ago, I said, we've seen peak Trump. It's going to begin to, he's plateauing and going downhill, and he's kept going up for the last 2 weeks, shows what I know. So it's very unpredictable, I think, and it's a real, the rules would suggest that he will fade and will not be the nominee, but once every 30 years, 50 years, right, 75 years, the rules totally get broken, and maybe this is that year.
From your perspective in Washington, can you comment on the difference between legislative action in D.C. and in state legislatures?
Yeah, I can. I live in Virginia, so I follow Virginia's legislature quite a lot, and where there's been both Republican governors and Democratic governors in recent years, obviously, different control of different houses of the legislature. I think the state legislatures are much more responsive, much more attuned to real problems and solving them. People expect their state representative to do something about different issues in the state. Doesn't mean that everything that gets done should be done, or doesn't mean that they don't duck problems too, but Washington really has become dysfunctional, I think, in the sense that everyone agrees that certain things are a problem, but you just can't get anything through. Maybe that will change. We've had a few years of divided government and pretty bitterly divided government, and that won't last forever. And so maybe that's just a temporary phenomenon. But right now, I think, certainly from a Republican point of view, the place Republicans can show that their ideas are practical, are successful, are popular, as well as being well thought out, is at the states. President Obama is not going to sign a whole lot of Republican legislation in the next year and a half, and he certainly hasn't done so since Republicans took the House in 2010 or in the first 6-8 months of the Republican Senate majority in 2015. So if you want, that's why I think there's a big burden. I said this when I spoke to the legislators, on Republican state legislators in particular, to pass sound legislation, especially if they have a Republican governor, maybe even if they don't. Or maybe they can work with Democrats, even when they're in the minority, and pass sound legislation, taxes, job growth, health care, education, and show that, from my point of view, conservative ideas, Republican ideas, really work. So from a Republican point of view, the next year is important at the state level.
The GOP made huge strides in state legislatures. What do you see in your crystal ball in 2016?
I don't know. They made such big strides, as you say. What do they control? 69 of 99 state legislative chambers. It's hard to believe they can get that much more than that. In a way, that's 70%. That's a lot by historical standards. But I think it would be very important if voters in states where Republicans took over one or both houses in 2014, 2012, whatever, off years, 2013, it ratified that kind of the takeover in a sense and say, yes, we're pleased with the new Republican legislature in my state. They're doing a good job. Sometimes in the past you've had these big surges for one party or another, but it goes away in 2 or 4 years. And then you say, okay, well, there was a reaction, there was a dislike with the other party, but it wasn't really a vindication, there wasn't a mandate for the party that won. If Republicans, getting elected once you can do on a negative platform. Getting elected twice, getting reelected, requires accomplishments. So I think in a way the second election for Republicans, the second wave in 2016, 2017, 2018 is in a way more important than even what happened in the last few years.
So I think most observers would say that these Republican-dominated legislatures are shaping the national domestic policy agenda. Congress, with GOP majorities in both chambers, seems unable to move their agenda. What's your perspective on that?
Well, there's a Democratic president who's got this, to his credit, has strong views and isn't going to bend and isn't much interested in compromising. He wants to go ahead and use his executive authority as much as he can. So it's very hard for the Republican Congress. With a Republican president, the question is, would that be really a different story? But I do think, for the reason you mentioned, though, a Republican governor, a Republican presidential candidate in 2016 would be well advised to run on a federalism platform. I think voters are pretty happy with what's happening at the state level, in a lot of states at least. Why not run on a platform of, the states work, the federal government doesn't. States don't work perfectly. The states work pretty well. The federal government doesn't work well at all. Let's get more power back to the states. I think it'd be a very common sense kind of proposal. It also fits with kind of conservative philosophical predispositions. I'm a little surprised there hasn't been more attention to the federalism agenda so far.
So to finish up, the Republican primaries in past cycles have been dominated by some of the most conservative elements of the party. Do you see that playing out the same way in 2016, and how do you think that'll affect the race?
I don't know. I mean, Trump seems to have support from all parts of the party in a fairly non-ideological way. This one feels to me less likely to be the standard establishment candidate, conservative insurgent. Establishment candidate beats back conservative insurgent. That's the Romney-Santorum kind of story, but that's often been the pattern. It doesn't feel that way to me. Just a lot of different candidates. I think it might be resolved a little more on personality or on individual agendas and accomplishments and abilities than on a kind of straight ideological fight. The candidates agree on an awful lot, honestly. So I think then the question becomes who would do a better job of actually implementing these ideas, who could beat Hillary Clinton or whoever the Democratic nominee is in the general election. When I talk to conservative audiences, to Republican audiences, I hear a lot of those two things: who can win and who could govern. Not quite so much who's loyal to every single, item on the laundry list of the conservative agenda.
Bill Kristol, thank you very much for taking the time to sit and talk with us today.
My pleasure.